Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as GU Politics. We're hosting this event in partnership with the Pew Research Center. My name is Libby Larson, and I'm a first year in Georgetown College, majoring in political economy and history. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I've had the opportunity to get involved with GU Politics, serving on Brian Stelter's student strategy team, and I've also been a part of McCourt in the Georgetown Undergraduate Student Association. I am pleased to introduce to you all of our guests for this discussion this evening. Tonight, we're joined by Jocelyn Kiley, Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center, Tony Fabrizio, Chief Pollster for President Trump's 2016 and 2020 campaigns, and John Anzalone, Chief Pollster for President Biden's 2020 campaign. Thank you all so much for being here. Tonight, our panel will not only dive into the trends behind the American electorate 1 year ahead of the 2022 midterms, but also shed light on the nuances of a divided American public beyond the partisan lens. Please join this conversation on social media by tagging GU Politics using @GUPolitics. I'll now hand it over to our moderator for this evening, GU Politics' Executive Director, Ms. Mo Alathi.
Thanks. Libby, thanks so much. Appreciate the introduction. And Jocelyn, thank you and Pew for partnering with us on this. If those of you who haven't seen it yet, will get a chance to see it tonight, but these guys do a pretty interesting political typology quiz that helps shed light on the electorate. And we're going to use that as our launching point. The title of tonight's conversation is Diagnosing the Divide. This is something I have been very focused on since returning to Georgetown a couple years ago to work at GU Politics. Because a lot of people ask all the time, like, why does politics feel so bad right now? Why is it so polarized right now? And I think it's a legit question, and we're going to talk about that tonight. I always point out, though, it ain't like it's always been sunshine and roses, right? Our politics has always been edgy at best. We've had one nonpartisan president in the history of the Republic, and the race to succeed him between Adams and Jefferson. They called each other liars, thieves, scoundrels, and much worse. We've had canings on the floor of the House of Representatives. We went to war with ourselves over whether or not we were going to keep people in bondage. We could go on and on. Over the past few centuries, we have been very polarized. But it feels worse right now to many of us. And we're going to talk about that tonight with three people who spent a lot of time thinking about voters, thinking about the electorate. And so I want to start by kicking it over to Jocelyn to walk us through the political typology quiz that you all do and what it tells you about who we are as voters.
Sure. Thanks. I have a couple of slides. We're not going to go into a big, long presentation, but just to give you a sense of what the typology is, because I'm hoping some of you have taken the quiz. We've had quite a lot of people take the quiz since we released the report last week. And really what the quiz is it's a way into this report, which is actually based on a really rigorous poll. And what we do is we've done this basically, some version of this going back to 1987 to really understand the textures and contours of the American political landscape among the public. We talk so much about Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and that's what a lot of people see. But really, at bottom, all of those people represent you and your fellow citizens. And so what we do is we segment the public based on political values, attitudes about the parties, which is not unimportant. People have feelings about Republicans and Democrats, and those aren't always linked to what they feel about political values and issues. And then how they feel about the political system as a whole. So you can see we do a big poll, we ask a lot of questions, and for this year's political typology, we use 27 to create it. And in the Q&A, if you have questions about it, happy to talk about it. And then there's a quiz, which many of you have taken, which is actually a little bit of a truncated version of the poll. But really, this year we identified 9 different political groups in the American public. 4 that tilt Republican, 4 that tilt Democratic, and 1 that's really divided about equally between the 2 parties. And I'll talk a little bit about each one. So on the Republican side, these are the 4 typology groups. Faith and flag conservatives, who are deeply conservative in pretty much every dimension. They are incredibly politically active, strong supporters of the former president. They stand out, and you can tell from their name, they stand out in their attitudes about the relationship between religion and public life. They really want to see government support religious policies and religious freedoms. Then we have committed conservatives who are nearly as conservative as the faith and flag conservatives, but they do differ on a couple of dimensions, and I think what's really interesting is particularly on things like immigration. They're not what those of you who may be Democratic in orientation, they're not moderate in that sense, and they're certainly not liberal, but they're not quite as hard line when it comes to immigration policy, for instance, and that shows up in a couple of other areas as well. They are a much smaller part of the Republican Party. And then we identify a group that we call the populist right. And they, too, are incredibly strong supporters of the former president. They also are very conservative nearly across the board, especially on issues about immigration and some other issues in similar domains. But one of the things that really distinguishes them is their own financial situation. They're much less financially secure than those other 2 groups I just mentioned, and they are also highly critical of the economic system. They don't necessarily think that government has a role, but they do, have a really critical view of banks and corporations, and they're actually, majority of them support raising taxes on the wealthy, which those of you who understand American politics, that's not a position consistent with traditional Republican orthodoxy. And they're the same size as the faith and flag conservatives. Both of them are the biggest groups within the Republican coalition. And then finally, we identify a group we call the ambivalent right. What's interesting about them, they're much younger than the other 3 groups. They're more likely to consider themselves moderate, though they are similarly conservative, especially around issues of government. So meaning that they are no more likely than the other groups to think that government should be bigger, and they're also quite conservative when it comes to attitudes about business. But they do distinguish themselves in some of their attitudes on social issues, in particular issues like abortion and legalization of marijuana. They are almost closer to the Democratic attitudes when it comes to that. They're also the most likely among these groups to not really feel at home within the Republican Party. More of them identify as independents who lean Republican than as Republicans, and they express other attitudes that suggest that they're not terribly happy with the Republican Party as it currently is. And they're also less likely to vote and be engaged in politics. A quick snapshot of the Democratic side. So we have 4 groups that make up the majority of the Democratic coalition, and here too we see internal textures. Right? So if we start at the bottom of this slide here, the most politically active group is a group we call the progressive left. Now what's interesting about this group is that they are pretty small. They're one of the smallest typology groups. They are very liberal. They're the most likely to call themselves very liberal. Not just liberal, but very liberal. And they have, across the board, liberal attitudes, including when it comes not just to the overall attitude itself, but to the extent to which change needs to come. So we have asked them a question about, is there more to be done when it comes to addressing racial equality in the country? Pretty much all the Democratic groups, clear majorities say yes. Progressive, then we follow up and we ask people, well, can you change things from within the system, or do you really need to completely rebuild the system? And progressive left say completely rebuild the system. And that's not true of the other Democratic groups to the same extent. They're relatively affluent, they're relatively young as well. And they're certainly among the loudest voices in the Democratic coalition. Then we identify a group we call establishment liberals, who in many ways are nearly as liberal. You look at their attitudes on most policies, they're about twice as large as the progressive left. But when you ask them questions about that question I was giving you as an example about need for systemic change, they're less likely to say yes to that question. Similarly, on questions about climate change, for instance, the progressive left really stand out, not for the need to invest in alternative sources, everyone on the Democratic side says this, but for the degree and speed with which that change needs to happen. And then we can move over to the Democratic mainstays, who deeply devoted Democrats, strong supporters of the president. They are, again, if you look at their attitudes, quite liberal, though veer more moderate on issues of immigration and also on the US military, the US place in the world. This group is a group that's much more likely than those two other groups I was mentioning to say that the US should maintain its military strength. It's a group that says, we really should maintain our superpower status. And you also see this shine through a more moderation, more conservatism when it comes to an attitude, say, like police funding. This is a group that does not subscribe to the notion that police funding should be decreased, and that contrasts with the progressive left. It also contrasts with the fourth group, the outsider left. What's interesting about this group, this is an incredibly young group, the youngest group in the entire political typology. You can see, in a lot of ways, they are closer to the center in their attitudes about the two parties, but they are nearly as liberal as the progressive left on a lot of attitudes and issues. But they are quite dissatisfied with the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Nothing is pulling them towards the center. They're highly unlikely to vote for Republicans, but I think there's an open question whether the Democratic Party can engage them in traditional partisan politics. They're not super happy with the Democratic Party as it is. And then the ninth group is a group we call the stressed sideliners. And this is a group that's about evenly Republican and Democratic. They're the least politically engaged group. They're among the most financially stressed. And you can see in their attitudes, they're split roughly, they're really quite in the middle. In that they tilt a little bit liberal on economic issues, a little bit more conservative on social issues. But the main issue is that they don't really feel terribly at place within either party. And they're also, because of their financial stress and other reasons, they're just not as plugged into politics, particularly as those groups, the faith and flag conservatives and the progressive left. The contrast is really strong there. So that's the overarching sense of what the political typology is. We're going to talk about all the details, but I just wanted, especially for those of you who haven't had a chance to take the quiz, I wanted to make sure you had a sense of what it is we were talking about. And again, mostly the aim of this project is to really give an X-ray into the public and politics today that doesn't rely just on Republicans and Democrats. That certainly is the case in electoral politics. Often we are just looking at those two groups, but there's a lot of texture within both of them. And I think it shows through even in electoral politics and primaries, but it's an important dynamic to just understand when we're trying to understand American politics today. So I will stop there and we can dive in to what's next.
Thank you so much. Tony and John, I want to bring you guys into the conversation now. As two people who have had to navigate incredibly contentious and complicated party primaries for your clients, as well as then a general election. Let's keep it focused on the parties for a second, each party's coalition, and then I want to broaden it out from there. And using this as the starting point, I'd love for each of you to kind of answer a similar question, right? Like, what is a Republican today? What is a Democrat today? What is it that they are looking for? And do you see in your research the same types of things that Jocelyn just outlined in her, the same sort of coalitions within each party framework that show up in the typology? John, you want to start?
Yeah, listen, I think, if we're being honest with each other, are we?
I'll go if you go.
Is that, listen, the Democrats, we have a much more diverse party. And I don't say that as a criticism. I just say it as a friggin' reality of the last 3 months watching the reconciliation and the Build Back Better bill try to get negotiated among Democrats, right? It is a really big party ideologically, demographically as well. And so you can see that it can be, it can be tricky. The fact is that what we see up here is in some ways what we saw in 2020. This kind of breaks the myth of what the Democratic Party is. I remember at the beginning of the Biden campaign, we had these decks about what our path to victory was before we did any polling. And also we did a big breaking the myths of the Democratic Party, which was that it was some like AOC convention, right? That it was an ultra liberal caucus, where in reality, if you take a look at this, the Democratic Party is probably 50% moderate and 50% what you might call liberal or ultra liberal, right? The fact is that there's different sections even within that, like ultra liberals and progressives, et cetera. But I think that what we would say in terms of what we stand for every day is, it used to be you would ask a question in a focus group, what's a Republican, what's the word that describes Republicans, what's the words that describe Democrats, and it was always, for Democrats, working people. We don't get a lot of that now because of branding, et cetera, from Republicans. But the fact is I think that what we're seeing, for example, with Build Back Better and what President Biden ran on, it was about creating opportunities for working families to have an opportunity in the economy, in the new economy, because pre-pandemic, we were seeing that, quite frankly, again, wages weren't being increasing. We weren't seeing, for example, the wages outpace costs, et cetera. And people weren't feeling that they were benefiting from the economy. And so I think that really encapsulates, our principles within the Democratic Party, is that we're trying to create a lot of opportunities for people to succeed in the economy, the economy now and the economy in the future.
I'm going to come back in a minute to talk about some of the tensions within each party, yeah. But Tony, I want to start, what is a Republican today?
Well, I think, and one of the things I think Jocelyn and the Pew study underscores is that the overarching umbrella that still kind of brings all Republicans together is the notion that they do not want bigger government. They don't like big government. And I think the other piece that brings the party together is their sense on economic issues. Yes, there is a segment of the party that the populist right that would like to see taxes. They're in favor of raising taxes, and they're not so trustful of corporations. But the other 70-some-odd% of the party still believes in those basic principles of lower taxes, less spending, more freedom. The other piece, I think, that shows here is that there is a big difference in the observance or the religiosity between the two parties. In fact, it's one of the biggest spreads that you see between them. If you go from the progressive left to the flags and the flags and faith Republicans, it's a huge spread. It's the 60-point spread in the importance of religion in their lives. And I think that also brings together Republicans largely. Now, there is a difference whether or not you think that public policy should follow God's law, but that has nothing to do with your personal observance about Republicanism. I would argue with my dear friend here when he says that we're less diverse in terms of the splits within the party. I think what's happened is that if you go back a decade, maybe even more, the Republican Party had as many visible divisions as the Democratic Party did. And there were fights between hawks and isolationists, and supply-siders and deficit hawks, and the religious right and the non-religious right. And they're still, those pieces are still there in the Republican Party. The difference is that Donald Trump, for better or worse, managed to stuff all of those into a box and make it largely about him and about his beliefs and his politics. Yes, really, that happened. Did you pay attention to that?
It was stunning.
You observed that?
It was stunning.
It still is stunning.
I know.
It still is stunning.
It's beautiful.
But I think Well, it's beautiful for you guys. But I do think that those divisions are still there in both parties. It's just a function of how they're focused on it. Right now, because Biden is the president, and he said something that I thought was so true, and I told John that when you have a 50-50 Senate, every senator is president.
Right.
And that's so true and that's why the focus is on them and not us. We seem more united, but if we were governing, probably the splits would show more.
The only thing I would disagree with is that when we take over a chamber, whether it's the House or the Senate, we're doing it with moderates. Like we took over in 2006, Pelosi became Speaker because basically at that time, we still had them, a bunch of Southern Democrats won in places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, Kentucky, right? And when we won in 2018, all the frontline Democrats who we're going to be basically protecting now are all moderates, right? And that doesn't happen. You guys win in a different wave scenario. And again, not being critical, but when you take a look at 10 and 14 and maybe 20, 22, the fact is that you're not going to be winning with a bunch of moderates.
Are you suggesting that our people would be out of the mainstream?
You will not be winning with a bunch of moderates. And that's what I mean by the fact that I do think that we're a little bit diverse. Not only in terms of what our caucus looks like, you have to admit there. But one other thing, and maybe you have an observation of the Democratic topography, is the one thing that I think is really interesting and is causing absolute agita, that's a word that us old Italian Americans use, heartburn, is the fact that the populist right. And I don't know if that's a new one or if it's growing, but the fact is that there is this, we've picked it up over the last 2 or 4 years, where there is a reaction that's very, I think, Trump-driven. There's different reasons for the reaction for anti-corporate with Republicans and Democrats. A lot of it is, maybe they feel like they're, stopping, tech companies are stopping Trump from expressing themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a fairly new thing that we're seeing. And there's actually a coalition with the Bernie Sanders types or the Warren types. She's going to be here next week. And some of the Republicans taking on, I mean, if you saw Marco Rubio's speech taking on corporate America, I think it was last week, it's worth taking a look at because it was, a mother or a son from a mother, whatever it's called, in terms of, this was language that is very populist in the Democratic way.
I would say that it's new to their topography, but I've looked and done topology studies of the Republican Party, and as far as 96, 97, there was a group that we called cultural populists. Now, they had a different frame that they were focused on. They were focused on affirmative action. They weren't as focused on immigration. What that morphed all the way through the early 2000s when immigration became a bigger issue. And what happened is you're right, Donald Trump gave voice to those people and actually grew that segment inside our party. And it's really odd that you see that it's flipped in that in all the elections before you had white, non-college educated voters that voted heavily Democratic and college educated plus voters voting Republican, and now it's flipped completely the opposite way.
And the other populist thing is that there's still about 40 or 45% of self-identified Republicans who support the tax portions of Biden's plan, meaning that they feel that big corporations don't pay their fair share, or they're ultra wealthy. Don't pay their fair share. And I think that that's actually fairly significant as well.
Right, and I would just add that I think even in our data, I wouldn't say the populist right came out of nowhere. Certainly go back to, even in the 90s, but certainly by the 2000s. And I think you're absolutely right. What you see is that group emerge as a bigger group and as a group that kind of, again, in our typology, becomes its own group. It becomes big enough to be its own group. But the DNA of that group was there.
But the reasons were different, like Tony was saying. Much different reasons now, and it's particularly negative towards big tech companies.
Well, but let me jump in, because I've been arguing this for a little while, and I'd be curious if you all agree with this or not. This has been 40 to 50 years in the making.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you think...
divide.
This sort of anti-establishment fuel to the divide. And I've been arguing that I think part of the problem in this town is that we're always talking about left versus right, but that's not the paradigm anymore, that the paradigm is more sort of front versus back. People who feel left out, stuck at the back of the line versus the people they see at the front. If you look at, Jimmy Carter running as an outsider in the post-Watergate and Vietnam era when people's trust in government had plummeted.
I'll never lie to you.
Right? And then Ronald Reagan getting on a very different kind of populist sweep, but a bit of a populist sweep, right? Also, government is continuing to fail you. Bill Clinton winning in 1992, fighting for the forgotten middle class, right? And the fact that the middle class was feeling left behind. Barack Obama running against special interests in 2008. 1 year later, the Tea Party and the Occupy movement ascended at the same moment, running against Wall Street and Washington. There's an anti-institution, anti-establishment sentiment because people have lost trust. Pew's done a lot of work on trust in institutions, as have other organizations. People have lost trust in almost every major institution. So if we're going to talk about the divide in our politics, it seems to me like that's the starting point. It's not just a lack of trust in government, big tech, Wall Street, every major institution except for the military, right?
The media.
Academia.
Yeah, academia, definitely.
Right?
Definitely.
And both parties are dealing with some of that internally in different ways, but
I would say that, listen, I think that in some ways what the catalyst of the divide is always economic. You went through a bunch of different presidents, and I would say that, what Clinton was tapping into, feel my pain, that type of thing, is much different than what Trump was tapping into, which was, I'm the victim, and it's because of them, right? I mean, he was expressing the bubble in people's heads that they didn't feel that they could say, because they were going to be politically incorrect, they would be beaten down, that this guy said. And not much of it was pretty, quite frankly. But my point being is that there were different catalysts or different reasons that I think in each of those scenarios, that president or presidential candidate was tapping into something that was basically economic.
I don't disagree with my friend that the catalyst is largely economic. Although I would say that it has been coming for the last 40 or 50 years. I know it's going to shock some of you in the room, but Donald Trump did not invent the slogan, "Make America Great Again." That was Ronald Reagan's slogan in 1980. Just an oldie but a goodie, comes back. But the fact of the matter is that this has accelerated because of the loss of faith and trust in the media and the explosion of internet, social media, all of those things, because now what has happened is we have, and we talked about this, I say it all the time, we have a more informed electorate, but not necessarily a better educated electorate. So they know how to look for information, but the information they look for is information that already fits their preconceived notion on issues. And so when they do that, the big tech companies, their algorithms see what they look at, and they just feed them more of the same stuff over and over and over again. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like being a hamster on a wheel, where if you look at Breitbart, they're going to continue to feed you Breitbart, and you're going to get Breitbart, and you're going to get OAN, and you're going to get Newsmax. And even the left doesn't necessarily trust the media anymore. When you sit in focus groups and you listen to people talk about it, it is astonishing how they just don't have any faith that what they're seeing on TV, it used to be when we did TV commercials, we didn't have to put a citation on the TV spot and the voters would believe it. Oh yeah, he voted for that. Then we had to put the citation. Now when you put the citation and you show them in focus groups, they're like, yeah, I don't believe that. I'm going to go look that up.
Listen,
I'm going to Google it right now.
People's bullshit meters are up here.
Yeah.
And I actually think that, in each campaign that we're in right now, you have to almost be so pure in your negative attack. And matter of fact, 90% of Biden's ads were positives, because we just saw that people didn't want to see Trump in ads. They were done with it. They just wanted to know what he was
They
about.
don't want to see him in his ads.
You're right. Yeah, I would imagine. Now, the only thing that I don't know if I would disagree, but I'll challenge the notion that this is all about mistrust, because it's a chicken and the egg situation. I think that it's hard to, again, say that Trump did not reinforce the mistrust, did not reinforce disinformation, and really became the poster child of that, right? And has driven this. And so I think that has, without a doubt, his 4 years in office, but when you think about it, he was there for, running for president, he's been post-president. The 6 years that we're in there, the disinformation and the negativism has created mistrust that is even higher than it was, or quite frankly would have been if you would have had, a John McCain or a Romney or a Marco Rubio, et cetera. And I think that's kind of hard to debate.
Sure. I think a way that I often think about this is to, Mo, to your point, we've been in a period of profound distrust in institutions that predates Trump, right? And trust in government is at record lows. And in some ways, that's the fertile ground, right? That's the fertile ground for what you were just talking about, right? So, if the counterfactual is a higher trust in institutions, higher trust in government, society, that fertile ground wouldn't have been there. So the two kind of have to interact to get together. And
it's a perfect storm. Like, if you get someone like Trump to literally metastasize the trust problem, it's going to only intensify. And quite frankly, there's always been political divide, no doubt about it. I mean, if you were...
It's just the discourse that's been around it.
Right.
That's the difference.
It is
It's always
caustic.
been there.
Well, and the lack of...
I think Joe Biden should stop being caustic.
I mean, I think we didn't explicitly say this, and it probably predates many of you, but those campaigns from the 2000s and certainly before then, the media was shared. There weren't these, you couldn't choose your own media.
Yeah, right.
You all
Right.
kind of got news from the same places,
Yep.
and it's impossible to separate that from the dynamics.
But let's again clarify that in your own poll, I can't remember what the percentage, maybe 3/4 of self-identified Republicans do not believe that Joe Biden won the election.
All
right.
It was 3/4.
It was. Depends on which grouping.
It depends on
The
which.
faith and flag conservatives definitely don't believe
Call
it.
me a liar for 60%.
No, I'm not-
It's a clear majority.
It
The
is
clear
about that,
majority. And so this isn't just, this is a new level of distrust that we have
Right.
because of because of a big lie.
So I want to get to student and audience questions in just a couple of minutes, because their questions are always better than mine. But I do want to ask a couple more before we do that. Joe Biden ran on, part of his message was he was going to help unify the country after a particularly divisive period of time. What is it, based on all of your research, right? What is it that can unify these groups, or at least a coalition of these groups? Because right now we're seeing trouble unifying the coalitions within each party. Is there, when we say we're going to unify, that's our goal, what does that even mean right now?
Infrastructure, Mo.
Right. So done.
No, listen.
Problem solved.
No, listen. I think
This
that there's a
event was
little.
like a
I
day
think
too
It's going to
late.
unify us, all right.
you can get oversimplistic about unity, right? I mean, there's a kumbaya unity, which people don't believe in, and then there's a unity of just getting things done, and that's what we found in our research with Biden, is that what they meant by bringing people together, it was about getting things done. We saw a little bit about that, American Recovery Act, now the bipartisan infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But it takes two to tango, quite frankly, right? I mean, you have to have partners on each side to be able to do that. We saw that on infrastructure. I doubt if we're going to see it on anything else. We're not going to see it on the debt limit, even though during Trump's tenure, I don't know how many times Republicans rose the debt limit. So, and maybe that would happen on both sides. But the fact is that I think we're at the end of being able to get people together, and we're now counting on our majority in the House, which is slim, And the fact that, all 50 of the Democratic senators are basically U.S. presidents, right? Like you just said. And, getting things done is really what people mean by unity. It's not about, holding hands.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Going to get a
you.
Coca-Cola.
I needed that. He does a lot of hand holding with me.
We're huggers. You
Yeah, we are huggers.
right?
I would agree with John that it's not the kumbaya sense. It's bringing people together to get something done for the common good. I will tell you that, for me looking at it, I think things have gotten to the point where to get the kumbaya moment would take something, a natural disaster of some type, another attack or a war. And I'm not even sure a war depends.
Pandemic couldn't do it.
No, because yes, it had a chance of doing that at the beginning. But the truth of the matter is that if you go back and you think about what happened after 9/11, that is the type of event, unfortunately, we don't want that to happen.
Right.
And we shouldn't have to have that happen for people to come together. But it's where it transcends everybody's ideology and it becomes an us versus them. And, we're no longer enemies, we have a common enemy, and it's not us.
And interestingly, 9/11, if you look historically at midterm elections, it saved Bush from not losing a chamber, and then he got reelected, and then he lost the chambers.
Yep.
And so
Crushed. We got
crushed. And it really was, again, it was a settling moment for America to kind of reflect, et cetera. Again, pandemic could have been that, but
the counter point to 9/11 is, yes, there was a lot of national unity around in the immediate wake up, but it didn't take that long. It wasn't that many years later before, and in fact, maybe some of the current moment of polarization is an outgrowth of some of the reaction to September 11th. That's a little.
The war certainly
Yeah.
was polarizing.
Sure.
That's what caused the polarization.
It would be very interesting. It's always the if, ands, and buts, right? It would be very interesting if
we had not gone into Iraq.
Right. Or, the fact is that 9/11 happens, and, Iraq war was definitely the what brought Bush down in a sense, and why one of the reasons we got Obama. And so it would be interesting if that didn't happen, to see if it had extended anymore.
Let me ask one last.
And for historical purposes, like we were really close to immigration reform passing between Democrats and Republicans under W, right? There were a bunch of things that had Iraq war maybe not gotten in the way. I don't know. You're looking with skepticism. We were close.
I am skeptical because what happened is Bush got way out in front of his skis on that. And when the base finally figured out what was going on and it got framed as amnesty, that was the end. They pulled back on those skis really fast.
And let's not forget the last president to do amnesty was Reagan.
Ronald
But let's not
Reagan.
get in that. Let's not
So
get in that.
let me ask one last sort of bucket of questions, and then we'll open it up. And that is the incentive structure for this, right? I mean, you ask anybody, do you want there to be more civility? Do you want us to come together? And like 90+% say yes, they want us to come together. But then, you see things like a member of Congress say the most incendiary thing and can raise millions of dollars in 24 hours in small dollar donations. So why would they stop saying the most incendiary things? And in the polling that we do out of the Institute where we track civility, one of my favorite data points is we ask people, like, okay, do you want there to be more civility in politics? And 90+% say yes. But then we ask it differently. Agree or disagree with the following statement. Common ground and compromise are noble goals we want our leaders to aspire to. Like 78% say they agree with that. Very next question. I am tired of leaders compromising on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. And 73% say they agree with that. So what is the incentive structure for our political leaders to push past the polarization? Do voters want us to truly be less polarized? Or are they just saying, common ground, sure, stand where I am and we're on common ground?
I just did a series of focus groups for a client in that exact conversation. I'm tired of Congress not getting anything done. One sentence. 2 sentences later, it's like, but they compromise too much of their values to get things done. And how do you bridge that with somebody? You try to explain to them that there has to be compromise by its very nature means somebody gives up. The problem is that a lot of people now think compromise is you give up 65% of what you believe, so I get 65% of what I believe. And that's not the way it works in true compromise, right? That's number one. Number two, you talk about the candidates saying incendiary things. Think about the media structure that echoes it and glorifies it and uses it for clickbait, and that's what becomes the story in all of these places. It doesn't matter if it's some niche website or a social media platform or whatever it is, they do it. That's what allows them to get the audience. And you're right, as long as they're going to get attention, as long as they're going to raise the money, they're not going to stop, because instead of being rewarded for what would be considered bad behavior, instead of being punished, they're being rewarded in a bizarre way.
And it's not just the clickbait or the dollars, right? It's primaries, right? We're seeing people lose primaries for being too conciliatory or for,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yeah, but I mean, look, the primary fights, you could also see people, for example, in his home state, if Judge Roy Moore tried to run in a Republican primary again, he'd never win a Republican primary again. It happens. You go too far, it gets there. The real problem is that there is a glorification of it, and it's not just by the party faithful on either side. When AOC says something, the left goes crazy and gives her money too, just like when Marjorie Taylor Greene says something. It works on both sides.
But part of what this is, and I think a lot of the points that you're making are that the incentive structure also is the most engaged people, and you see it in the typology, the most engaged people are those progressive left and the faith and flag conservatives, right? And so to some extent, you're incentivized to pull to those parts of the party. But just to also say that another dynamic that you find is so a lot of people say, oh, well, just engage the middle. Just really, we should focus all our, but when you engage the middle, they become.
But Jesselyn, here's the big difference again between the Democrat and Republican. If you take a look at primaries, right? First of all, in 2018, most moderates won Democratic primaries. Progressives didn't. That's why you got Gretchen Whitmer, right? That's why you got Steve Sisolak, et cetera, Ivers, et cetera. The reality is the incentive structure on the Republican side, and mostly because you kick our ass in redistricting, is that there's so many safe Republican seats that a lot of the governing has a lot more to do with the Republican primary universe than it does the swing voter universe. We have to win our majorities by frontline Democrats, moderate Democrats winning swing voters. And often the reality is to keep your coalition, they have to win Republican primaries because they're afraid of being primaried by ultra conservatives. And this is going to play out in 2022. The most entertaining season of 2022 is going to be Republican primaries for Senate, House, and governor, because Trump is the big issue. He's going to be endorsing, and what you might consider the moderate or the favorite candidate with a better resume isn't necessarily who's going to win. And if you remember 2010 and 14, there were seats, mostly Senate seats, that were dead bang winners for the Republicans. And Sharon Angle won in the Republican primary in Nevada, and Harry Reid beat him. And Christine O'Donnell, the supposed witch, won in Delaware, and Chris Coon beat him.
What did you call her?
The witch. That's what she called herself. God damn. And then if you remember Joe Donnelly and Murdoch on the abortion thing, like they nominated such out of the mainstream that it gave Democrats the opportunity to win some seats. And I actually think that's their biggest fear right now, because the incentive infrastructure is to get really conservative, not lose the Republican primary, but it often causes problems with mainstream.
Our biggest fear is how are we going to sit 260 members of the House?
Oh, God, I love you.
No, I mean,
you're going to have to go across the aisle? Is that it?
I'll just add, I mean, I think some of that is, as you mentioned before, the size of the conservative, the two parties are different in terms of how loud, not how loud the edges are, but how big those are, right? That the
Yeah.
progressive left
Right.
is a pretty small,
small
share,
group.
and that there is a pretty big group that we call the Democratic mainstays they may not be as politically active, but they're politically active and they're more moderate. And so the dynamics of those intra-party
We are
fights are
definitely
just
not
different.
as ideologically diverse as the Democratic Party. It's a conservative-dominated party.
But it's also one part of your success is why they're in lockstep, man.
Yeah.
Lockstep. I mean, you don't see the Republican caucus. They would never go through 3 months of this open fight on a bill, like what we've seen with Democrats.
All right, I'm going to pause there because I want to start bringing in some additional questions. Do we have a mic for?
Right there?
Oh, right here, right in front of me, of course. Okay, so come on around, and if you have a question, line up over here. And when you get there, tell us. Don't be bashful. come on
Age,
up.
rank, and serial number.
Name, where you're from, school year, and then please frame your question
Social
in the
security
form
number,
of
credit card
a
number.
question. Okay.
Your typology.
Your topology.
Yes, exactly.
How did
Because you all took
test
the
out?
quiz while sitting here, right? Okay.
Hi, my name is Pratik. I'm a freshman, a first year in the college. Mr. Anzalone, I listened to you on David Axelrod's podcast in July, and I know you talked about how the Biden agenda was looking good for the 2022 midterms. And I know the Democrats were sort of riding high back in June, July, and a lot of things have changed. So I just want to get your perspective on what are your thoughts on what's changed since then and your prognosis.
That's a great question. And here's what's really interesting is that even though this Build Back Better agenda has been around almost the entire year, and we've gone through this really messy process of trying to figure out what's going to be in it. And we've had, 100 or 2 million spent on us by the Republican infrastructure. The popularity of it hasn't changed. And so what I would say to you about that is that, hopefully we get something passed because people expect you to get something done. And there's a lot of impactful things here, right? And I won't go through all of that. But it's a tough political environment out there. We all know that for Democrats. We just saw it in Virginia. We just saw a really close race in New Jersey. But the silver lining is it's November of 2021 and not September of 2022. And so what I would say is that we actually have some good tools in our toolbox in terms of having a potential strong message about what we have done for working families, small businesses, and seniors by, again, doing impactful things on lowering costs of health insurance premiums, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, elderly care, child care, parental leave, et cetera. So it's to be seen. Back then, it was looking a different political environment. My point to you is when the bell rings in September of 2022, we're probably going to be in a different political, economic, COVID environment, and we may have a really strong message about what we've done for working families, seniors, and small businesses. Doesn't mean that we're going to keep the House, but I'll tell you what, it probably means that we're going to be more competitive than people in this city and the media think we are today.
I have a really short answer.
Oh my God.
And it's dun 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 dun.
I love when the expectations are really, really high on the Republican
All right,
side.
thanks for the question. All right, next.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a freshman in the SFS from New York City. My question concerns the accuracy of polling. So I think that there's been a lot of questions after the 2016, 2020 general elections, Senate elections, about whether polling accuracy is declining. We've seen declining response rates, increasing educational polarization based on trust. And we see that this has significantly affected where candidates campaign, and a multitude of ways in which Americans no longer necessarily believe that polling can accurately, quote unquote, predict the results. So I think, as people who have polled for these campaigns, I'm curious what you think about what are the causes for why polling was less accurate in the 2016 and 2020 cycles, if you believe that is the case, and B, do you think this is a fluke regarding Trump or COVID, or what do you think about kind of the future of polling's ability to accurately give us a landscape of elections and what the American public thinks?
I think the worst thing about polling is the media polling. I think the media does polls to report a headline. They want to create a headline. They want to generate news. And the media oftentimes does their polling the cheapest way possible. And when you do your polling, the media doesn't do polls to figure out how to win a campaign. They do polls to figure out how to generate a headline. We do not do polls that way. We do polls to figure out how to win campaigns and how to help our clients and our candidates. And that is two different things that you're looking for. A poll, if you've taken statistics, you know that 95 out of 100 times, the poll will be right. 5 out of every 100 times, it's just going to be wrong. It's the law of statistics. It's just the way it works. But more importantly, the universe in which you survey is important because the survey will only be representative of the universe you survey. So in 2016, the media polls were not surveying as many Republicans as actually showed up. In fact, Republican affiliation turnout was higher in several of the states that Trump won than it had been in 2012. And they also did not survey enough white, less than college educated voters, which had flipped to Trump previously from 2012, where they had voted for Obama. So you take those two factors and they can turn a state that was maybe a +2 going in Democrat state and make it a +1 Republican state. And so, and in 2020, there were just more polls and there was more noise. I think some of the media polls were actually pretty good. Some of them moved to a better methodology. There was some that were outliers that were still bad because they were doing online panels or they weren't interviewing registered voters, they weren't doing likely voters, a million different reasons. But my polling, and I'm sure his polling, I know his polling, we did not have the problems that they did because of the way we do our polling. Because of the way we construct our sample frames, the universes that we sample from, et cetera, et cetera.
The only thing I would add, and we've talked about this, is we're constantly innovating. So there were, without a doubt, problems. It wasn't just about not getting the right non-college white responses. It was getting the right type of non-college whites. For example, we were getting too many non-college whites in service industries instead of non-service industries. So we've done a lot. And there's just a universe that will not take a poll with a live caller, but we can now get them in ways where they don't feel, they don't trust institutions, they don't trust people, et cetera. So I do want you to know that we're doing a lot of innovation. We're spending a lot of money. Polling's super expensive, and you just have to spend a lot of money to do it the right way.
One of the things that we're probably one of the only two pollsters that do this extensively is we use a technology called SMS to web, where it allows us to get people who won't respond by phone, and they don't have to talk to a live operator, which there are a lot of voters that don't want to express their opinion anymore to live operators. They don't want to be judged.
All right, I want to try to get in a couple more since we're coming up close to the end of our time.
Hi, I'm Kesley. I'm a freshman in the college studying biology, ironically. And my question is kind of for all of you, but mostly for Tony. I'm allowed to call you Tony, sorry. Okay, so if we can all agree that far-right conspiracies like QAnon are harmful to our democracy, why do we continue to engage these voters? For example, Youngkin used dog whistle politics on issues like critical race theory, and McCulloch kind of put his, McCulloch kind of put his foot in it, but anyways, point being is, why do we continue to engage these voters if we can, all agree as a consensus that it's actively, causing problems like January 6th?
Well, I don't know that critical race theory call is January 6th. I do know that McAuliffe stepped in it in Virginia, and I do know that in some places there are problems where they're trying to teach critical race theory. And elections are all about letting voters decide. We can't predetermine. The moment we start predetermining what voters can and can't hear is the moment we become no better than the social media titans that decide who they're going to ban and who they don't ban. It's a question of free speech, and whether we like it or not, and whether we think they're crazy or not, they're still entitled to have their speech. But there's a responsibility on the other side, and that is the responsibility of the voter to be able to parse through and figure out what's fact and what's fiction from what they hear. QAnon is, their beliefs are nuts. I mean, one of their beliefs is that Angela Merkel is the granddaughter of Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's just provably untrue. provably untrue. But you know what? There are people who believe it. Do I agree with them? No. Should those people be able to not vote or express their opinion? No. They should be able to vote and express their opinion. And if I start censoring them, do I start censoring AOC because I disagree with her position on defunding the police?
So here's what I would say, is that there is not a police of political rhetoric. There's no one who kind of polices it. And 90% of Joe Biden's ads in 2020 were positive. Nearly 100% of Trump and Trump's allies' ads were negative. Just a fact. I mean, we can almost do the flip of it with Hillary. Hillary, a disproportionate percentage of her ads were negative. But the fact is that, again, I don't believe you just get free speech to tell lies. We got hit a lot that Joe Biden wanted to defund police. Joe Biden actually didn't want to defund police, and we went on TV and we said, no, that's a lie. I didn't want to defund police. Actually, my plan says I want to increase funding for police departments. So there is this tension, right? I mean, without a doubt, Joe Biden is president, and so every time you elevate that he is not president, any Republican, that it was fraudulent, et cetera, it's not, to me, free speech. It's a lie, right? And so, but there's no one out there policing that. And as Tony was saying before, there's actually social media platforms who are elevating that. And so there's a lot of problem out there with disinformation. I mean, every week we would get a disinformation report in the Biden campaign about what Trump and Trump's allies were saying about him. Horrific stuff, by the way. And I always wondered what their disinformation stuff looked like on us, which we were just talking about differences in policy stuff.
Dossier.
Still, yeah, thanks. But you know what I'm saying? So I just want to, because you asked a very serious question, which is, I believe, incredibly frustrating in our political dynamics, is that there's no one out there who can stop political rhetoric or political lies or disinformation. It's just impossible.
And you can't. Because once you start doing that...
Well, you can by not doing it.
Well, you can, but you got to stop the people. But then you can't stop people from lying.
I mean, the one
you
thing...
can't. What do you police lying?
I'm not saying that's the frustration.
I know.
I mean, the one thing I'll add to bring it back to what we were talking about before is, again, the environment of trust and views of institutions, right? In a time of low trust in institutions, distrust in the media, that provides the fertilizer for some of this.
That's fine, but the bottom line is,
right,
is if Donald Trump had stood up there and said, just like Hillary Clinton did, who lost by just almost the same amount in 3 states, and I was there, watching her concession speech in the transfer of power of how this, if Trump had done that exact same thing and you were doing your polling right now, 80% of Republicans would have said Joe Biden is the legitimate president. So I get the infrastructure of the foundation of trust, but there is a catalyst who is driving the big lie.
Right. No, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not trying to sort of both sides it, but I do think that it's important. A lot of these things are really not in the domain of saying we can't do this, or they're in the domain of what the political norms are and what behavior is incentivized by different groups.
We're at a new level. I mean, we have politicized science.
Well, and that's the thing, right? To me, I just wonder, it's a whole chicken and egg thing for me, right? When I hear everything you're saying about the big lie, but the other big one is COVID and vaccine hesitancy. And when the only time Donald Trump has been booed by his own voters at his own rally was when he went out there and talked about how he delivered the vaccine. And he got booed by his voters, right? So where's, again, the incentive structure? What, chicken or egg, right? I think he's...
Well, I actually believe the way Trump wins is just a little tweak on, his presidency of, on masks and, responsibilities and things like that. And I don't think that his people would have left him, and he might have gotten, those 60,000 votes he needed.
maybe.
But the reality is that as
Gotta
president,
rub it in, don't you?
oh, I mean,
Gotta
you
rub
can give me 60,000 reasons why Hillary Clinton's not president.
Yeah,
Damn it,
I could.
So
I could.
keep rubbing.
Emails. I didn't.
All right, let's get one more in. I'm about to get the hook, so let's try to get one more in. And for those of you in line, I'm sorry, but we'll try to get
We'll
you
stick
next.
around.
They'll
I'll
stick
stick
around
around.
for a few.
Okay. Hi, my name is Sanjay. I'm a junior in the.
Can you get a little bit closer to the mic?
Sure. I'm a junior in the business school, and I am from the Maryland suburbs of D.C. So we talked a lot about the lack of trust in institutions, from both sides of the political spectrum, and it seems to me that the distrust comes from two different, perspectives. On the left, it's a lot more economic distrust of corporations, the economic system, the rich. And on the right, it's much more about sort of public-facing institutions, universities, media, politicians. I'm wondering where you see a possibility for institutions of both varieties to start gaining trust again, if that's possible.
That's a great question.
And sort of why sort of trust in institutions is so diverged.
Wowza. Wowza.
I mean, one thing I'll add while
That's your
everyone's...
question, Jocelyn.
Well, yeah. I mean, you
Sounds
can
like a few
figure out what the
questions.
solutions are. I'll add to the diagnosis of the problem. I do think it's also, I think that's a great question, but I also think it's worth looking at trust in government and looking at partisan trust in government. And one of the things that's really important to understand is, of course, it switches, right? Democrats are more trusting than they were when Trump was in office, and vice versa. But if you look at this line, Democrats today are not terribly trusting in government in this generic trust in government way. And the same thing, Republican trust in government was nowhere near where it was under Ronald Reagan, under Trump, or even under Bush, right? Trump may be unique in a lot of ways. And so I just want to point to that I don't think it's just these kind of certain institutions are places the Democrats trust, but there is something a little more profound. I think it's a real challenge, and I'll leave it to these guys to figure out the solution.
This is very sad to say, at least from the Republican perspective, the institutions that you talk about that have lost trust, that the Republicans have lost trust in, there is absolutely no incentive to regain trust in them. And the reason for it is, particularly on the terms of the media, is there is just so many different ways and channels that people can get information that I don't need to search for what is the absolute truth. I can search for my truth.
Right.
And I know that's a dangerous place to be, but and by the way, go back 50 years, that was not the case. It was not the case.
This is a really sad thing. You're going to hate this. Is that we ask a question in our demographics that's not even about institutions. Do you generally trust other people?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You want to know why it's hard to get certain responses, right? And that number is it's approaching 30%. So it's not just about institutions. It's also about just trusting other people, right? And I think we forget that we're in our 20th month of the pandemic as well, and this has accelerated this. We're all fatigued, and again, politicizing, masking and things like that. But at the same time, if you're looking for a little hope, there was that time in April and March, and April and May and June of 2020 when, strangely enough, because people weren't trusting Trump, people were trusting their governors. They were looking for a place to get good information that they could trust. So it didn't matter whether you were a Democrat or a Republican or an independent governor, that's where people were going. And whether you were a Democrat or Republican, their job ratings and trust numbers were going through the roofs, literally sometimes in the mid to upper 60s. Yeah. Now that dissipated once people got fatigued and mask mandates and all that type of stuff went out. So you occasionally see just a little blip. But I couldn't tell you what the next blip is because it's pretty dire out there right now. People are sour. And people think that it's just the political side of it, or Biden or Trump or Pelosi or Schumer or McCarthy or whatever. But the fact is we don't put enough into the fact that we're 20 months into a pandemic and we are a fatigued country.
I love ending on an optimistic note. It's pretty clear I'm not going to get it from these two, so I'm going to leave it to Jocelyn. Take their quiz. Take the typology quiz. See what you are. Look, our motto, our slogan at the Institute is public service is a good thing, politics can be too. That feels like it's been tested.
Wow, that's a shot against you and I.
It's been tested a lot lately. But I got to say, in an era when we don't trust one another and Democrats and Republicans sure as heck don't look like they even like each other, thank you guys for modeling what an actual conversation could look like once again. So John, Tony, thank you.
And we should have said this at the beginning, is that this is a really important special place for us because both of our daughters graduated from Georgetown. I know Tony's daughter's in the audience. And this is just a splendid place with just an amazing administration.
I think we paid for one of those
cannons. Yeah, we probably did.
front.
We paid something. So we wanted to let you know that you know, for 4 years of our lives, or more for yours, this was an incredibly special place. So it's special for us to be here too.
Thank
So
you.
thank you,
Welcome
Mo.
back to campus.
Thank you,
Jocelyn,
Jocelyn.
thank you, and
Mo.
to Pew for being our partners on this event and for all the work that you do. We still all have a lot more work to do to sort of deconstruct what's going on and
Can we
tackling the
come back and do this
polarization.
after 22?
Let's do it.
So I could do the jig?
Let's do it. We'll see how big of one, though. That's the old DNC guy in me coming out. Apologies. Thank you all for sharing part of your night with us. Please stay tuned for more events. Our next big event is the Tuesday after Thanksgiving in Gaston Hall, where we will be having a conversation with Senator Elizabeth Warren about how we can level the playing field in conversation with our own geopolitics fellow, Rebecca Piercy. So please come and engage in that conversation. And with that, have a good night. Thank you.
Where can Tony sign up for that? Tony wants to sign up for that.
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren and I, perfect.
How about you?